Imagine trying to colonize hundreds of tiny islands scattered across the Pacific with just a handful of soldiers, a couple of boats, and no real plan. I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and in today's episode, we will dive into what might be the dumbest Spanish colonization ever. The disastrous attempts to control the Caroline Islands after a diplomatic conflict with Germany and pressure from Spanish nationalists. Stick around to find out how Spain's desperate bid to defend its declining imperial prestige led to a sad and embarrassing story. Today's story mainly takes place in the late 19th century, but let's start with some historical background. In the 16th century, Spain funded several expeditions to explore the Pacific, and some of these explorers passed by the Caroline Islands, a group of about 500 small islands and atolls in Micronesia, south of the Marianas. It's unclear who the first European to see the Carolines was, because explorers often gave different names to the islands they found. However, this debate isn't important because Spain didn't conquer the Carolines during these early explorations. In 1686, a captain named Francisco de Lezcano named the island of Yap the Carolines, in honor of King Charles II, similar to how other islands were named after Spanish royalty, like the Philippines or the Marianas. Later, this name extended to the entire group of islands we know today as the Caroline Islands. In 1696, shipwrecked sailors from Palau arrived in the Philippines, which renewed the interest of Spanish authorities and Jesuits in colonizing the Carolines, as they had already done in the Marianas. In 1705, a Jesuit traveled to Europe and convinced the Pope and King Philip V of Spain to support the Jesuits' plans for expansion in the Carolines. Over the next 30 years, with the help of Carolinian immigrants from the Spanish Marianas, the Jesuits led several expeditions to find the richest islands. However, these attempts failed, costing a lot of money and some lives. In 1731, an Italian Jesuit named Juan Antonio Cantova left Guam, reached the Ulithi Atoll, located about 200 kilometers east of Yap in the Western Carolines, and established a mission. Cantova sent another Jesuit back to the Marianas to request more resources and men to defend the mission, but when that man returned in 1733, he discovered that Cantova and 13 other members of the mission had been killed by the natives, with only one Filipino surviving. This marked the end of the short-lived Spanish mission in the Carolines. In the 19th century, revolutions in Europe and independence movements in Spanish America created a new world order and a new idea of sovereignty, which also affected Oceania. Spain, worried about losing its claim to Pacific territories, tried to define its borders in the region and adapt to a new global reality. The Pacific was no longer seen as an extension of Spain's American territories. Britain, France, and Spain funded scientific expeditions in the late 18th century not out of a selfless scientific spirit, but to find new lands to control, new markets to access, expand their religion, and boost their international reputation. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, missionaries, traders, and whalers acted as representatives of their countries, helping to bring new territories under European influence without the high costs of direct colonization. This was seen in places like sub-Saharan Africa and the Kingdom of Hawaii, as we discussed in the episode about Don Francisco de Paula Marin. Spain, severely weakened by the Napoleonic invasion and the loss of most of its colonial possessions in the Americas, found it hard to govern its territories in the Pacific, like the Philippines and the Marianas, due to poor communication with Spain and limited resources. Spain struggled to stop other powers from gaining influence in Oceania. It couldn't prevent Methodist missionaries from Hawaii from reaching the Carolines, which Spain claimed, or stop foreign traders from setting up posts to export products like copra. By the late 19th century, Spanish elites and public opinion realized they needed to defend the remnants of the Spanish Empire in the Pacific. Spain tried to use old treaties, historical maps, and writings by foreign authors to justify its territorial claims. However, by then, arguments based on the right of discovery and conquest were no longer enough. The major powers now recognized sovereignty only when there was actual, effective control of a territory. In 1875, there was already a diplomatic conflict between Spain and Germany over the Palau Islands. The Spanish consul in Hong Kong demanded that a German ship pay custom duties for passing through these waters. The Germans refused, arguing that there were no Spaniards on the islands and no real Spanish control. The newly formed German Empire, driven by a strong sense of nationalism, wanted to join the colonial race, even though most territories had already been claimed by other European powers. They began to take over any unclaimed or remote territories they could find, including the Marshall Islands, which lie to the east of the Carolines. The success of this move naturally attracted them toward the Carolines. Between 1882 and 1884, several foreign residents and local Carolinian leaders sent petitions to Manila asking Spain to establish an administration on the islands. If Spain did not, they warned, they would seek protection from another power. By the late 19th century, there was growing pressure for a state to manage the islands, settle conflicts, and enforce laws. In January 1885, the Spanish government ordered an expedition from Manila to take control of the Carolines. By March, the Spanish had signed agreements with some local leaders and foreign residents. However, in August, the German ambassador announced Germany's plan to occupy the same islands, claiming they were unowned. At the same time, 2 Spanish warships were anchored at the island of Yap. A few days later, however, they encountered a German gunboat. The Germans learned that the Spanish had not yet officially claimed the islands, so they hurriedly raised the German flag and declared a protectorate over the Carolines and Palau. In response, the Spaniards, along with a Chamorro woman named Bartola Garrido who lived on Yap, raised Spanish flags. The Germans believed they were following the colonial rules set at the Berlin Conference that year for Africa. They had informed another power of their intent, raised their flag, and presented a document of possession signed by local and foreign residents in Yap. However, Spain had already made moves to claim the islands a few months earlier, except for raising the flag. Faced with this challenge from Germany, Spain refused to give up its claim, as doing so would mean accepting its role as a second-rate power and a loss of international prestige. This disagreement sparked the diplomatic conflict known as the Carolines Question or Carolines Crisis. The incident angered many in Spain, leading to attacks on the German embassy, boycotts of German products, and the creation of nationalistic plays, songs, and poems. There were also widespread rallies and calls for war across Spain, fueled by the press and private efforts to raise funds for new warships. Suddenly, the little-known Caroline Islands became a top priority for the nation and a territory that needed to be seized to demonstrate the glory of Spain. For Spain, the Carolines became what economists call a positional good, meaning their value came mainly from keeping them out of the hands of powers like Germany, the United States, or Japan. This was the absurd reasoning behind Spain's involvement in this colonial venture. Spain asked Pope Leo XIII to mediate the conflict, and in his decision, he recognized Spain's right to the islands. In exchange, however, Germany was allowed to trade, sail, and fish freely in the waters around the Carolines, and Spain had to acknowledge Germany's control over the Marshall Islands. So, Spain officially started governing the Carolines. Like in the Philippines and the Marianas, Spanish colonial authorities in the Carolines often complain about a lack of resources, whether money, people, or materials like ships. It was very hard to exercise effective control over these islands in Micronesia, because they included hundreds of islands with a scattered population. A territory of this nature was just too much work for only 2 ships and 100 Spaniards, who divided the islands between the western and eastern Carolines. Effective Spanish control was mostly limited to naval bases on the islands of Yap and Pohnpei and the mission in Palau. Even on these islands, Spanish law was not always enforced, and other islands were rarely, if ever, visited by Spanish officials. Spanish officers acknowledged this reality, sometimes with honesty and sometimes with shame. And the fragility of a Spanish administration in the Carolines was also well known to the international community. One officer admitted, quote, "Our rule in Chuuk is purely nominal, since we do not exercise it with any permanent function of authority, of which we are completely lacking there. And even our demonstrations of power have been limited up until now to 2 visits made by the gunboat Quiros, which certainly cannot be considered a solid basis for domination." End quote. Another officer noted, quote, "The islands south of Ulithi are in complete ignorance of things, to the extent that they did not know who the Spaniards were, and were unaware that those lands belonged to Spain." End quote. There was never an intention to dominate all the islands, given the scattered nature of native settlements and the limited prospects of economic profitability. The only Spaniards who lived in the Carolines were soldiers, Franciscan Capuchin missionaries, and Bartola Garrido, a Chamorro woman who worked as an interpreter for the Spaniards and as a teacher at a public school established in her home. With such limited resources, enforcing laws was difficult, and Spanish authorities often faced the dilemma of whether to use force or to let offenses go unpunished at the cost of prestige and authority. To avoid greater harm, they generally chose not to use force unless the matter was very serious, like repeated outbreaks of violence in Pohnpei or conflicts with American Methodist missionaries. The soldiers who served in the Carolines began with a strong sense of duty and understood the political importance of possessing the islands. But over time, their nationalistic enthusiasm gave way to the everyday problems they faced. They endured harsh living conditions with little food or medicine, worn-out clothes, poor communication with the outside world, and a dependency on supplies from the Philippines. They also dealt with sometimes difficult relations with the local Carolinian people and foreign residents. Disillusionment grew, and most Spaniards in the Carolines began to question whether holding on to these remote islands truly served Spain's interests, or if this colonial endeavor was a result of a misguided sense of patriotism. It was incredibly frustrating to be colonizers without enough resources to reach all the islands and only being able to maintain peace and keep an eye on the activities of foreign residents. Some officers were outraged about the difference between how the Carolines were portrayed in Spain or the Philippines and the reality they experienced in the colony. One officer wrote, quote, "On the ground, I could understand how much is spoken without sense, how much foolishness is written by people who have not even seen them on a map, and how mistaken the opinion formed about them is in our Spain or even in the very capital of the Philippine archipelago." In a Manila newspaper, praise was not only exaggerated but false about the prosperity of the island, singing in excessive praise the imaginary progress of the colony, its trade, and our domination. End quote. In short, 100 men sacrificed themselves far from home so that the elites and the nationalist public could live under the illusion of a Spanish colonial greatness in the 19th century. This was the sad and foolish purpose of the Carolines under Spanish rule. Usually, states incurred a net loss in their colonial projects, and the ordinary nationals and foreigners subjected to colonial rule suffered the consequences, while the ruling class and some individuals profited from the colonies. However, in this case, even the Spanish elites didn't gain anything. For example, there was no significant export of copra, wood, or tropical fruits because neither the government nor a Spanish private capitalist wanted to invest in this god-forsaken archipelago, perhaps due to doubts about how long a Spanish rule would last. Meanwhile, these products were traded profitably by companies and merchants from Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Japan. because under the terms agreed upon in Rome, they didn't have to pay taxes to Spain unless they did business in areas directly occupied by the Spanish. The Spanish officials sent to the Carolines could not concern themselves with developing profitable economic projects because their most immediate concern was to survive, maintain peace, and exercise whatever authority they could with the limited resources available. Toward the end of Spanish rule, things became especially difficult due to both internal and external problems. These included conflicts between Catholic and Methodist Carolinians, the Philippine Revolution, and the Spanish-American War. These events left the Spanish authorities in the Carolines cut off from Spain and without essential supplies, which were only partially addressed by German ships from the Marshall Islands. Before starting peace negotiations with the United States, Spain agreed to sell the Carolines, Palau, and the Marianas, except Guam, to Germany for 25 million pesetas. This agreement took effect in the Carolines in October 1899, just 14 years after Spain took possession of the islands. The Spanish legacy in the Carolines was limited because the colony's purpose was flawed from the start. The economy of the Carolines was never developed or exploited, few Carolinians were converted to Catholicism, and there were few friendly relations between the Spaniards and the natives. This is an embarrassing story about how purely nationalist fervor and pride fueled Spain to colonize a remote territory that, after the diplomatic conflict with Germany was settled, no one cared about anymore. However, a few Spaniards and hundreds of Carolinians suffered the consequences for more than a decade. That concludes this summary of the history of the Caroline Islands under Spanish rule. If you want more content on the history of Spain, subscribe to New History of Spain on YouTube or to the podcast if you only want a chronological history of Spain. Join the Discord server and help me continue and grow this channel by sharing the show and supporting it in exchange for perks like early access or exclusive merchandise at patreon.com/newhistoryspain or with a one-time donation. Links are in the description. If you have any topics related to Spanish history you would like me to cover, please leave your suggestion in the comments. Thank you for listening and see you soon!